Okay, all right, so now we're in phase 2 of our kind of machine learning pipeline. I'm just going to get this pulled all the way up here. All right, so just as a reminder, let's move me kind of out of the way here. As a reminder, this is where we're at kind of here. So we talked about that first week. You guys went through that case study where we talked about, kind of data acquisition and questions about whether the data would necessarily fit our questions. And so now we're moving over here. We've decided that, it looks like we've got a good question going. We believe that we have the data necessary to potentially answer it. 2 big things that we need to cover. We've got a metric that we'll kind of independently track. And now we're moving into the next phase, which is kind of getting a better understanding of the data that we have, all right, that we've gathered through, that we've acquired. So we have to make sure that it's clean and ready to go. And then we have to kind of just do some initial framing of the data in order to make sure that it can answer our questions. So we'll get into more of this kind of down the road. This second phase, we're really going to focus on this, right? We're just going to get the data cleaned up, have a better understanding of what it can and can't do. All right, so we're really kind of just in prep for model creation. All right, oop, there's a little thing. Great. All right, so here are the things that we are going to explore in this. I'll try and do it as quickly as possible. I just want to note that each one of these, and we're going to talk more about them throughout the semester, each one of these, several of these are quite expansive topics. All right, so missing data, people have written entire books on just how to handle that particular problem. I'm just going to give you some quick examples of how to deal with that. Cross-validation is another one. That's a pretty deep topic. There's lots of ways to think about doing that. And we could spend quite a lot of time on data types and variable types, but we're just going to skim over kind of the high level stuff, give you the necessary tools that you need to get started. And then as we go along in the semester, we're going to add a bit more complexity. So don't feel like you have to understand all of this right away. We're just going to get through kind of an initial overview of these topics, and then we're going to keep using them throughout the semester. So you become much more familiar, and we'll expand the kind of scope of them. All right. So variable types, let's get right into this. All right. So many of you should probably already kind of be familiar with this, but there are essentially 5 variable types here. All right. I added this one. All right. So even though it says 5, there are 6. I need to check my slides before I start writing. All right. These, by all intents and purposes, are the same thing. It just has to do with memory space, essentially. Like this is bounded, I think, to maybe 1 billion size, something like that. And this is just limitless. All right. Complex numbers. All of these things you should probably understand. We're going to get into factors a good bit because that's an important kind of thing to understand. It's really kind of a unique class of character. So that's why some people don't list it as like a canonical type by itself. But its properties are so distinctive from string and character values, I think it's important to understand it by itself. Okay? All right. So we have the variable types, right? These are variable types. We also have data types, okay? So we have lists, all right? And our objects contain all sorts of different elements, including vectors and functions, and you can have lists inside of lists, nest list. You can have data frames inside a list, all right? It's a very expansive type of data type, all right? You also have a vector and a series of just one data type of these, okay? All right, so it's just one of those. You can think of it like a single column in a data frame is a single vector, a single list of character words, whatever that might be, all right, that can be a vector. We already looked at an array. Remember, we had a multi-dimensional array. Think of that as kind of basically a list or vector with 2 or more dimensions, all right? So be it 2 by 2 by 3, all right, it has this third dimension, all right? That's what we think of as a 2 by 2 by 3 array, all right? A matrix is something that we're probably all a bit more familiar with. It's just a 2-dimensional data structure. It's typically numeric, doesn't have to be. It can be one of these, all right? But you can think of a matrix as basically a collection of vectors, all right? They have to be the same data type, right? Or same variable type. It's kind of a collection. And a data frame is the one that we're going to use the most. It's the most flexible object inside, in terms of, flexible data type inside most object-oriented programming languages, all right? So we can combine many of these variable types, all right, into a 2-dimensional rectangle table, all right? So it has the same kind of characteristics as a matrix in terms of its dimensions, all right? But key characteristics separating from a matrix to a data frame is that we can combine variable types, right? So we can have factors and numeric and integers and characters, right? It will all be in one data type, but it only has 2 dimensions. That's another important characteristic. If you have multiple data frames together and have multiple dimensions, and you start to move into an array, all right? Okay. These are some useful variable and data type functions, okay? So we've covered this one, right? It gives you the structure of the particular data frame or list or whatever that might be, all right? Class will tell you what type of data type it is, all right? So you do that, or it will tell you what type of variable type it is, all right? So that's a polymorphic function. For those of you that are familiar with that, is that it can take many forms depending on what is passed into it, okay? All right, names will give you all the column names, all right? Just kind of give you an idea there. Length will tell you the length, and dimensions will give you the dimensions of the object. So if you're wondering if it's an array, like what dimensions are, you could pass it in, it will tell you it has 3 dimensions, all right? If it's a data frame, it will tell you what the 2 dimensions are in length and width, all right? So this is going to be one of those things where I want you guys to try this out a little bit, all right? So open up RStudio and try these functions out on the mtcars data set, and then let me know if you agree with the output, okay? In particular with str. I think we've looked at this a little bit before, but take a look at what's there and see if you agree with the output, all right? Just pause right here, go ahead and get that started. We're going to use the mtcars data set kind of throughout this lecture. You're going to be jumping back and forth, so it makes sense just to go ahead and pause and get that pulled up. Okay, welcome back. So, prevalence, right? This was pretty easy, but it can be kind of tricky in verbalization, right? In order just to be able to get it quite right. So it's the proportion of a particular population found in the positive class, all right? So now positive class doesn't have to be like some type of positive attribute. Actually, it could be, the presence of spam. And one would say that is positive, but that's the target variables 1 classified presence. The presence of spam equals 1, all right? As an example. So prevalence is basically just the balance of our target variable, all right? So when you think of 1s and 0s, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, 1, I don't know, I'll try and balance this out. All right, let's say this is a 0, all right? So we got 3 zeros and 3 1s, all right? Our prevalence here would be 50%, all right? So 50% of the data has 1s, 50% of it has 0s, okay? So that would be the prevalence. So we just think about this in terms of that target variable, all right? So go back to the mtcars data set. Let's do a little bit of work there too, all right? See if you can figure out what the prevalence is of the VS variable, all right? It's a little hint here, all right? You might be able to use the table function, all right? There's easier ways to do this once we get in. There's lots of functions that give us the prevalence, but table is going to be a nice way for you to think about being able to do that. It'll just show you the different classes, and then you can just do some simple math. All right, so see if you can figure out the prevalence for the VS variable. It's just 1s and 0s in that particular variable. All right, let's jump back over there. Come on back when you're ready. Okay, all right, so scaling, normalizing, and one-hot encoding. All right, so we've already covered a lot of ground here. Not most, but many data science algorithms, machine learning algorithms are going to require you to normalize the data in order for it to be passed and be learned appropriately, all right? So the main kind of scaling normalization technique that we're going to use is going to be a min-max scaler, all right? I'll get into one-hot encoding in just a second, but a min-max scaler takes something and it just places it inside a range of 0 to 100, okay? So what it does is it will maintain the variance of that particular data, of that particular object, of the particular variable. So just bear with me here. Just imagine if you had a variable that was associated with weight, right? So say it was down here to the very extreme, 400 or something. All right, so it probably looks something like this, right? All right. So we did a min-max scaler on this. We're basically just normalizing it. Instead of from 0 to 1, we're just changing the x values from 0 to 100, all right? And the distribution is going to look exactly the same, all right? Pardon my terrible drawing. But when you look at the calculations of how this would look on just a simple kind of density plot here, it'll look the same. These will match, right? The only thing that'll be different, right, is the range of these values, right? And what this does is it allows us to put all the variables independent of their range inside the same, independent of their variance, inside the same range, okay? So if we had another variable, say we're trying to measure, let's just see, how many times people went to California in 1 year, right? So what's the average of that? I don't know, maybe it's between 1 and 5, all right? So we're trying to compare something from 0 to 400 to 1 and 5. You know, that would be pretty hard to compare, okay? But we just take this one, instead of contracting it, and we do exactly the same thing, all right? We just expand it out between 0 and 100, and then weight and the number of times people happen to travel to the West Coast would have the same basis for comparison, all right? This is important because often, remember if you remember back to KNN, right? We do KNN. How does KNN work, right? If you remember our in-class example, right? We're trying to figure out what this particular data point is based off all the data points around it, all right? And so maybe we pick 3, or I did a pretty bad job. And anyway, so this one would be plus, right? Because it's got 2 of the 3. 2 of the 3, all right? Inside a particular range are pluses. We'll get more into that just for this example. But see, this wouldn't work, right? Because this is a graphical based measure if these ranges weren't even, all right? What we want is kind of this non-biased spherical multidimensional space, all right? If we have variables that are contributing to this that are all sorts of different sizes, we would have some weird shape. Anyway, I'm just making this up. And so the balance of this wouldn't work very well, all right? So what would happen is that something between 0 and 5 would probably get used to be way more heavily on the classification than something was from 0 to 400, all right? So there would be an unbalanced nature to how that hyperdimensional space, so that region, was being generated inside the algorithm. All right, so we want those to be normalized. It also just makes things, to be honest, quite easier to interpret. It makes things faster because everything's kind of on one scale. It makes calculations move quicker. All right, so there's lots of good reasons to do that. You don't always have to do it. Decision trees, for an example, don't necessarily depend on the scales being the same, but it still can kind of be best practice to do that. All right, so that's a min-max scaler. All right, we got a function that does it. All right, I'll show you guys how to use that. All right. Okay. All right, so the other thing we want to talk about, where we did min-max scaler, what's the dearest factor? Is factor variables. All right. This is for one-hot encoding. Okay, so and people that are familiar with kind of the inferential language around this will be familiar with dummy variables, all right? One-hot encoding is the same thing as a dummy variable, all right? Just said in computer science language. All right, so say we had a factor that had 4 levels, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, all right? So this is how it would normally be represented inside our data frame, just in this little list like this, all right? But in order for us to be able to use this in certain machine learning algorithms and graphical based ones to include, all right, in order for it to be efficient, all right, we want to get rid of these nested levels, and we want to actually just spread them out and have them be their own levels. So instead of 4 levels going down vertically, what we would see is we would have 4 variables. We'd have x1, x2, x3, and x4, okay? So the way this would translate, that would be a 1, 0, and a 0, and a 0. All right, this one would be a 0, and a 1, and a 0, and a 0. All right. You guys get it, okay? All right, and this is corresponding to the different this would be a 4, it would be a 1. All right, so just pretend these are different rows, right? 1, 2, it's probably, actually I should use A, B, C, and D, it might have been easier. You can see this corresponds here, 1 goes there, 2 goes there, 3 goes there, 4 goes there. So instead of the numbers, just the presence of that particular factor level in that row gets represented by a 1, right? This is in computer language, which is 1s and 0s, and makes everything much more computationally faster and allows you to use certain factor levels inside certain machine learning algorithms where you couldn't do it before, okay? So it's easy. So we got 2 of those, min-max scaler, right? We're going to use that a lot. And then this one-hot encoding, all right? Both very traditional kind of machine learning prep, all right? So what I'd like you to do, this might take you a little bit longer, all right, is to use the min-max scaling function in the grad descent package. Okay, so you're gonna have to load this package in, all right, and you're gonna have to find the min-max scaler function and then just scale empty cars, all right? Put it into a new object. What I mean by that is, something that looks like this, all right, and then whatever the function is probably just something along these lines. I don't actually have it totally memorized. Min-max, and then just pass in empty cars, and then just take a look at X, see what you said, figure out what type of object is it. Use a class function, all right? All right, and see if you can view it as a data frame. All right, so try and give that a run. Okay, all right. It might be kind of a special class of object. It's a little bit tricky, but you'll figure it out. Okay. All right, welcome back again, all right? Okay, so missing data, huge topic here, all right? So we could spend many, many weeks on this, all right? But what I want you to make sure to understand is that this is something you have to check for when you start working on your data, all right? You can't just go in blindly and assume that every cell is populated, all right? Happens to be a pretty big problem relative to, it's a common mistake. I'll just say it that way. Students go in and they'll start working and all of a sudden they can't get things to work and they don't understand why. Well, it turns out they have some NA missing and one cell is empty. And many of the machine learning algorithms or evaluation techniques that we're going to use just won't run if there are NAs inside the data set or any type of missing data. All right. So R comes with a whole bunch of functions and packages to handle missing data. The most common one that people use is the mice package. All right. It stands for mean imputation something like that. Anyway, so it stands for missing imputation. I probably shouldn't have started because I'm not totally sure. Anyway, there's some acronym there to include missing and imputation, all right? I should have looked that up. All right, but the idea is to give you tools to not only identify patterns of missing data, but to also replace them. Imputation is another word for replacing missing data, all right? Sometimes you can just use. The most common one that the mice package uses something called predictive mean modeling, all right? Predictive mean modeling. And what that does is it basically creates a predictive model for what that particular cell would be based off the cells around it, right? And then inputs that output. So it kind of predicts. You think about just developing like a regression output, predicting what any one missing data point might be, and then inputs it as a result. Okay. So the things that we need to make sure to understand here, I feel like this is not always emphasized as much as it should be, is that what we want is our missing data to be completely random, all right? It'd be great. You don't ever want to have missing data, but when you pull it up and you find that there seems to be large amounts of data missing in one column, or there appears to be equal amounts of missing data in two columns, or whatever that pattern might be, all right? Whatever your human intelligence intuition looks at it and says, oh boy, there looks to be patterns here. It's non-trivial that there are, the same large amounts of missing data in one row as in another. Then you need to dig under the hood and try and figure out why, right? So that could be a systemic problem with how the data is gathered, right? If you have that, when you go to delete it, what you're going to be doing is deleting some systemic error or issue with the data, which means it would be a biased model because of that, right? So that's a problem. So what we want it to be is, and I guess I got ahead of myself, what we want it to be is totally at random and not missing not at random. I don't know if do we really need acronyms for this? But we have them, but I don't know if we need them. But we want it to be missing at random, right? So a nice way to get a good look at this, all right, is just to use a summary function, all right, on a data frame. So you can do that with the Beaches data set. It has a little bit of missing data. I would have stuck with empty cars, but there's no missing data there. So you can do that, and it'll just show. It should show you at the very bottom after it gives you kind of neat little summaries of the mean, the mode, the range, all sorts of stuff like that. For each of the variables, it should show at the bottom where missing data is. So try and do that. All right, pause it here. Data frame, you have to load Beaches and the mice package. Well, no, you don't have to load the mice package yet. I'm going to have you something to do with this. Summary is a base R function. That'll be in base R. And then check and see if you can find the missing data in the Beaches data frame. All right, and then just come back. Okay, now that you're back, all right, generally we wanted to avoid if there are missing values better than 5%. I don't know. I sometimes break this rule, but if more than 5 to 10%, something like that, of the one particular variable is missing, that's a big chunk, right? So you have to figure out exactly why that is the case, all right? So you could delete those values, all right? That's one way to handle missing data. If there's not that many of them, you just go ahead and delete them, or you can try and attempt imputation, right? And so again, the field of imputation is just vast. One of the most simplest way to do it is mean imputation. And that would just be to take the average of that row and put it in for the missing data, all right? I would encourage you not to do that if you get anywhere close to this. If there doesn't appear to be a pattern, all right, in the data, and you're under 5%, maybe mean imputation is fine. If there's not a pattern, but you're above 5%, that's a lot of mean average values to put in to replace. You're probably better off deleting those if there's no pattern. If there's a pattern and it's above 5%, you got to figure out where the data is coming from and why this is occurring, or do a much more robust process for imputation. Otherwise, you'll almost certainly have biases built into your data. Okay? So the mice package, you'll have to load that in. There is a function there called missing data pattern, md.pattern. You can pass that in, and it will show you a little bit more detail, similar to what summary does about where that missing data is. All right. We can also use something called complete cases, all right, to remove the NAs. I'll show you how to do that in this slide. All right. So once we've identified where our, we're just taking a look either through MD pattern. You can use that on beaches if you want to. It should give you just about the same information in the mice package, or just using summary. And we've used our intuition about whether we think there's a pattern or not, or how much of the data there is missing. You can just do simple math there once you know the number of missing cases. Then complete cases is a way to remove it. There's lots of ways to do this, by the way. Is NA, you can use like an exclamation point and get rid of the NAs. I mean, there's lots of ways to do it. This is just one, okay? The nice part about complete cases is it kind of works just as an index, all right? So you think of an index, it just searches and it'll use Boolean indexing, all right, to show whether something is missing or not. So just as true, false, true, false, true, false throughout the entire data set, all right? So you have this data, kind of this data frame full of trues and falses, all right? And here, if you just have a single vector, all right, remember what a vector is, it's just any one list of things, all right, not a list, but anything with just one column of a particular variable type, all right? This is the variable here, all right, and you pass in complete cases, it will create an index of the missing ones, all right? When you pass that into it, all right, and basically you're just, all right, so you're using the same variable here 3 times, all right? So this is creating the index inside, and then it's reducing the space of that particular vector by just the true cases that are in here, and then passing it into a new, just replacing the old one, all right? So these are, depending on what the number of missing values are, it just replaces over them. So it will, complete cases is a function that will identify those missing, location of those missing values, and delete them, right? This is the same thing. You can do it on a data frame. Here, we're just in a much more kind of traditional row column format, right? It identifies all the locations of where there are missing values. And keep in mind, it will delete the whole row, all right? So that's why this is in the row place. Remember when we do indexing, it's row column, okay? So identify where all the rows are that have missing data, and it'll delete them. Okay, and then pass it back into your original data frame. You also change the name of this data frame if you want, just to be cautious. Say we'll call it data frame 1 or data frame clean or something. And then here you can just get a little bit more specific, right? If you just want to be very discrete about where the rows are coming from, right? Which columns it should search for, all right? Then you could do it that way, all right? All right, so try these on the. Anyway, we did this on the beaches data set. All right, but then try and use this technique right here. All right, and just remove the missing values. All right, use complete cases just in the same syntax that's located here. All right, and see if you can get rid of those missing values. All right. All right. Okay, partitioning and sampling. All right, so it's a big portion of what we do, and after we've cleaned our data set, got our variable classes in the right class. Okay, we've done one-hot encoding, we've normalized, we're doing all this data prep. Right, we're trying to get ready for machine learning. All right, and the next step is to do data partitioning and sampling. All right, it's kind of the same thing. All right, so we need to split our data into 3 sections. Okay, remember we have. This is our large data set, all right? We need to separate it into training, into tuning, into testing, right? So typically the way you do this is something about, my these are uneven, 20, 20, all right, and this would be like 60%, all right? Okay, and so this 60%, this big number up here, we're going to reserve for training. And the other two are going to be split equally between tune and test. The reason that we do this is that we want the data that we build the algorithm with, the one that we learn it on, to not be the one that we evaluate it on. All right, we want to try and do some level of separation to try and give it new data. Remember, we talked about this over and over again, that you won't really know how it works until you put it out into the real world. But this is one way to do it, all right, just to get started. Give yourself a chance at evaluating just how well the algorithm is working, and it's the way that machine learning is done. All right, so this is how we define these things. This is how we build the original model. All right, some people get tuning can be a little confusing. Okay, so tuning is the data that we pass into the trained model. By trained meaning that we trained a model using 60% of it, and the first thing we do is we evaluate it using that tune data. All right, and we do that principally because we're going to make changes to that algorithm, all right? We're going to change the hyperparameters, right? We're going to build more features, okay? We're going to maybe oversample. We're going to undersample, right? There's all sorts of things that we can do to modify the changing process, training process, that will affect how that machine learning algorithm is learned, all right? And so we're going to use the tuning set. Every time we make a little tweak, all right, we're going to use the tuning set to see how well the model improved. Right? And if it improves, then we're going to keep those changes, right? If it doesn't improve, we might go back and change something else. And then we'll evaluate it again with the tuning set. It's not until we're done, until we think we're not going to make any more tweaks to the hyperparameters or to the data features that we're passing in, or any of the other number of changes that you could make, are we going to use that test set, right? We can put that test set, take it out, put it on the shelf, just forget about it. Right? We're going to do that at the very end, right? Until we've punished this data, so we can't think of any more creative ways to put it into our algorithm and make it perform better. Then we'll kick out test and we'll do like one final evaluation and say, all right, we made all the changes. Now let's see how it did. Okay, that's the idea behind these three different partitions. Right, one that's a bulk for training, another one is used to evaluate after we're doing feature engineering and manipulating the algorithm to see how they would work. And then very finally, at the end, we pass in this test data set. All right. The function we're going to use for this is create data partition as part of a caret package, right? You can load this in if you want to. The major setback with this is that it's really designed just to do one partition. All right. So to solve this problem, we run the function twice. All right. So we'll do one partition where we do 60-40. Right? We'll get our 60% up here, and then we'll just split this one again to get our 2 20s. Right? Kind of annoying, but oh well. If we're in Python, the data partition function there actually much better. You can set it out to what partitions that you want. Works a little bit better. But in this particular one in R, it's a little bit more complicated to be able to do 3 partitions. So we just run it twice. That's the easiest way to do it. All right. The important part, and the reason we use the nice part about create data partition, now that I've said lots of bad things about it, is that it does allow us to do stratified sampling, okay? If you see code online, if you're doing machine learning and people are not doing stratified sampling, their models cannot be trusted, right? Stratified sampling allows you to maintain the distribution or the prevalence, right? We know what prevalence is. The prevalence of the target variable in each one of our partitions. If we don't do that, you can imagine a scenario where we might create this final partition, say, and if we just had 1s and 0s, there would be no 1s in it, right? It would just be all 0s. It would just be all 0s up here, right? And that would be very biased. We would have no idea how well the algorithm was actually working or if our changes were effective, okay? So we need to make sure that we do stratified sampling to maintain the distribution of the class levels, or if it's a continuous variable of the actual variance, right? So the variances are all the same. You can think about the samples are all the same like this if we were doing little density plots on each one of these partitions in order to be able to get a balanced evaluation, right? So that's the critical part about this sampling, all right? We need to make sure to do that, all right? Okay, we're going to talk more about this in class. Just want to get you a sense about this. Cross-validation is a way to train our model, okay? So we do cross-validation when we're doing this particular, using the training data, all right? So we're doing, can I circle that enough? All right. When we're doing the training data, okay? The problem with doing just the kind of canonical splits that we've talked about is that the bigger we make the training set, the smaller we make the test set. Right? So there's this constant tug of war between the two of them. Like, what's the right balance? Do we need more training data? But then we might not be able to evaluate it enough, all right? Cross-validation helps us solve this problem, all right? And what it does, all right, and we'll talk more about this. This K is just a number, all right, typically 10 or 5, all right? In this example, I think it's 4, I guess. Instead of dividing our data into these big 3 parts, what we'll do is we'll take this one big part here, right? We'll still do these 2, still get rid of those 2 parts. But then we're going to train our model differently on this 60%. Instead of passing all of that 60% in, what we're going to do is we're going to divide that up into little individual training and test sections, okay? All right, so instead of learning the model 1 time, all right, we're going to learn the model in this example 4 times, right? So we're going to train it 4 times with, say, 80% of the data dedicated to train and 20% of it dedicated to test. But that test set, right, is going to be holdout, going to be different than the next holdout, and different than the next holdout, and different than the next. And in theory, the way that this works, right, is that we get to use the entire data set, all right, multiple times instead of just passing it all in at once and getting one big model, all right? So we create some variation. This is akin, if you're familiar with the term, it's essentially bootstrapping, all right? So we're taking many different samples, all right, of the same training data and learning many models. And so it's a way for us to get a better sense of what the best model is as compared to just running it 1 time. The way that this works is just runs it a bunch of times, and then it just takes an average of the results. Just combines all the models together, takes an average of the results, and that's what you use as your model, okay? We'll talk more about this. Cross-validation does take some time to wrap your head around. Again, I'm just introducing it here. We'll talk a little bit and I'll show you how to do it once we get into some of the modeling processes. But hopefully over time, it'll become intuitive to you. Okay. All right. So that's it. This went a little longer than I had hoped. We covered a lot of ground here, and we're going to review a lot of these topics in code. All right. On Thursday, I'll go through some examples, and then we'll have a lab for you that has you practicing these techniques. All right. So the next phase of this, all right, after we've got through kind of the data preparatory phase, gone through clean, anyway, done all the things, is to move into model building itself, all right, into solution development, all right. So here we're still kind of doing data prep. You can think of this as kind of us combining maybe combining these 2 steps, all right. Oh, look, I got a different color. Combining these 2 steps together once we move into initial model building. All right. Thanks, and I'll see everybody on Thursday.